But yeah, like even back in the day, he would just eat like. Steve told me that he would just be the type of guy like at a bus stop and go grab a spider and eat it.
Yeah.
He loves that. He loves that.
Yeah, it hasn't changed much either. But yeah, he'd have his chalice, and live he'd feed.
Yeah,
the
I've eaten a worm with Lord Worm.
Hey guys, Brody here. I know I look a little bit different since I've been away. Nah, I'm just kidding. Not Brody, thankfully. My name is Radon666. Small chance you know me from my solo YouTube channel, but I'm on Downfall Network right here, right now to talk about some Canadian technical death metal excellence. Cryptopsy. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with the band's first two albums. Their debut, 1994's Blasphemy Made Flesh, and their follow-up, 1996's None So Vile. Maybe you remember the controversy around the Unspoken King, and maybe you didn't even realize that this band had put out material over the past 10 years, the quality of which we shall review later. But first, some background on the band. The main characters in early Cryptopsy are the guitarist John Levasseur and drummer Flo Mournier. They're kind of like the main songwriters of the band. And then, of course, the immaculate, the incredible, the immortal Lord Worm on the vocals. Lord Worm is famous for his deep, gurgly, guttural vocals, but he's also quite the character.
Hey, why don't you get attention by eating worms? Steve looks at me and says, yeah, do that. Well, I've been known to put earwigs in my beer, so yeah, okay. And one of them goes, hey, hold on a second. He goes and gets, it was the bottom part of an old lamp, but it kind of looked like a chalice. So I used that for a while until finally I went and robbed a church and took a silver chalice of my own. I still have it.
Lord Worm was also in charge of writing the band's lyrics. And his lyrics are very dark, yet there's also an element of humor to them. And I only learned there was an element of humor to them after I've been going through all these interviews. I got a better idea for who, the kind of guy that Lord Worm is. Because as I was reading the lyrics myself, I'm like, oh man, this guy is weird. But enough of that. Time to get into the music and Cryptopsy's debut effort, Blasphemy Made Flesh.
And I was showing him how to do open-face surgery. You know the song.
Yeah, of course. Blasphemy.
The first one.
Sure.
I didn't have a yellow highlighter, but if I'd had one, it would have been like, okay, so do this letter, and do that syllable, and skip over this, and because that's the way I do it.
This album gives you about 2 seconds to prepare yourself before you get absolutely mollywopped by the album opener, Defenestration. And this album establishes two, foundational cores of Cryptopsy's sound. Number one, drummer Flo Mournier is a human machine gun throughout this whole album. And number two is that the bass, and more specifically like kind of slap and or thumped bass, is very, very prominent in the songs, which I think was something that kind of Cryptopsy kind of pioneered the use of, at least in extreme metal. Not to mention Lord Worm's absolutely disgusting and wretched vocals. He usually has a deep guttural, but he does occasionally bust out some wicked high screams. Overall, this is a great album to start with Cryptopsy, a great way to start their career. I think it has the best blend of quality while also not being as intense as some of their later output. On a scale of 1 to 10 for intensity, I'd say this album is only at a 10, whereas some of the other albums that we'll talk about, they start to crank it up to 11. My favorite songs from the album, opener, Defenestration, which to this day, Cryptopsy tends to open up their live set with that song. You also got Abigor, Born Headless, and Memories of Blood.
I've also heard a story that while you were recording None So Vile, and you did your vocals in one day.
I did my vocals, and that's what, a 30-minute album, 32 minutes?
That's right.
Yeah, so just the time to find, cue up the next song. So what would that take, about 35 minutes? That's how long it took me.
Holy.
One take. When I was working in the Res Nuclide, it was the same way. They called me Lord One Take.
Really?
I know my shit. I wrote it. We jammed it enough times. I don't need the lyrics in front of me. They're all up here. One take.
This is the album that turned Cryptopsy into death metal legends forever. This album is theoretically heavy enough to create a black hole, and everything that they did on the last album got a LeBron James-sized serving of human growth hormone. Lord Worm's deep growls are more ferocious, and his high screams are even more blood-curdling. And drummer Flo Mournier must have taken like a gas station romance pill or something, because despite sounding like a machine gun on the last album, he manages to go faster for longer. And I'm saying, hey, look, ladies, I can do that too. 6'1", I'm just saying, 6'1", I can do that too. Guitarist John Levasseur also really stepped up his game. The riffs are faster and filthier, but I think the best addition to the sound was the introduction of these super headbang-inducing breakdown riffs that you got in songs like Slit Your Guts and Graves of the Fathers. With a lot of tech death, I find that the songs tend to kind of just bleed together throughout the album, but with this album, every song is memorable and distinct. And to be able to do that while pushing the boundaries of speed and extremity in metal is why this album is frequently in a lot of people's top 10 death metal albums of all time, including my own. Unfortunately, shortly after they recorded this album, Lord Worm would have to leave the band.
It was more a case of it wasn't fair to my lady friend at the time. We've been together a few years. We stayed together a few more years after that. She was basically supporting us on the puny salary of a cosmetician. Here's me off, touring and not making much money, but getting the name out there. And she's by herself for, weeks on end, no boyfriend, little job, paying, everything alone because I'm off. Right. It just wasn't fair to her. Yeah. Couldn't do it, so I had to leave.
So Lord Worm was out, and Cryptopsy hired Mike DiSalvo, who was in a band called Infestation. They released a couple demos out into the 90s, and they had their lineup now reset, so they were going to head into the studio, make their third album. How would it turn out? Let's find out.
So I definitely went into it to try to mold a new album, and from there, if we went into a different direction, and I felt that we were going in a different direction at that point. But I definitely, like I was saying earlier, I didn't want to come in and mimic anything Wormy was doing. That was nothing that I wanted to do.
Most people who listen to Cryptopsy will basically just stick to the first two albums and just kind of stay content with those. And, I guess fair enough, there is a lot of music out there in the world, but Cryptopsy's discography has so much more to offer for those who are willing to listen. Now, I will concede that Cryptopsy's sound does kind of change a bit. Mike DiSalvo has a different vocal style than Lord Worm. Mike's vocals are a lot more precise and on time. If Lord Worm is like a deranged madman just wildly wielding an axe, Mike DiSalvo just dices you up, cuts you up with surgical precision. And I think the band leaned into this precision more by kind of upping the production a bit. It's not like they totally sanitized their sound. These riffs are still heinous. But with all that being said, I still don't see why, if you like the other two albums, I can't see why you wouldn't like this one. To this day, the band usually plays a song from this album in their live sets, either Emaciate or Cold Hate and Warm Blood, the latter of which has this really cool, kind of clean, jazzy sounding part. And quite frankly, I think this album gets slept on solely because it doesn't have Lord Worm on vocals. I understand that, Lord Worm is a legend, and that for some people, Mike's vocals are different, they might be too jarring, they might not hit the same, but you still have Flo and John writing the material, and the material is well within the realms of what you would expect from, the classic Cryptopsy sound. But hey, so far, so good for the Mike DiSalvo era. But how would the band follow up this album, and more importantly, how would they open up the new millennium? I'll be honest, I think this is the first misstep of Cryptopsy's career. I wouldn't go so far as to call this album terrible. It does have a few bright spots, but Mike DiSalvo's vocal performance is definitely a step below Whisper Supremacy.
For myself, I had been sick during the vocal when we were supposed to record the vocals. I was sick for that week. We were on a tight schedule at that point. We had been given quite a bit of money from Century Media to record. We had, I guess, 4 weeks or so to record it. And it came down to the vocals at the end. Yeah. And during that time, I had the flu that was leading up to it. So when I listen to it, I hear it in the voice. And all that preparation that led up to it and all those arrangements and everything. And I hear there's certain parts I'm just like, put your head down and you're like, but it is what it is.
I remember that being the first thing I noticed when I picked up this album. I just remember thinking to myself, like, this guy doesn't sound like a demon the way that Lord Worm does. He kind of it just sounds like a guy who's yelling at me. And that doesn't quite tickle my pickle the same way. You do still have some crazy ass songs on this album though. Take the third track, Voice of Unreason, which just has an absolutely maniacal guitar riff. All of the good stuff can basically be found on the first half of this album. Once you get to the B-side, it falls off harder than Lars Ulrich's live drumming.
We have to start it again?
You got a song called Soar and Envision Soar Vision. The hell is that? Is this the Mickey Mouse Comedy Club pun hour? What the hell is that? And the album closer, Screams Go Unheard, has like this really weird intro bit, and then the song kind of has some spoken word parts. Like, yeah, no thanks, I'm good. But after the band recorded this album, key creative contributor and guitarist John Levasseur decided to leave the band, basically just citing a lack of interest in wanting to make extreme metal music, as did vocalist Mike DiSalvo. So to replace Mike, the band hired Martin LaCroix, who would feature on the band's 2003 live album, None So Live. An issue the band would encounter with Martin, though, is that he's French-Canadian, and so that means his English is not very good, so his stage presence wasn't always the best. He couldn't really write lyrics in English. So who does the band hire to teach Martin English? Who else but Lord Worm? And that's because Lord Worm, when he's not in Cryptopsy, he works as an English as a second language teacher for French people. So basically he teaches French people English. So Lord Worm was working with Martin until eventually Lord Worm got a call from a drummer and band leader, Flo Mournier, saying, "Hey Lord, instead of teaching this guy how to be our front man, why don't you just come back into the band?" And Lord Worm agreed.
Yeah, you've been away and you don't know, but the band got like kind of popular. Oh, isn't that nice for you? Now you're back. Well, that's not so nice for me then. Because I'm not used to this. You're used to it.
The whole support team was there, the management and whatever.
Oh, wow.
And they're all kind of fawning and simpering over me. I said, why? I said, don't you know? No. You're a legend. I am? When did this happen?
2005 was a great time to be a Cryptopsy fan. Lord Worm was back in the band, and the fans couldn't be happier. The Mike DiSalvo era definitely has its fans. I would call myself a fan of it. But, you can't beat the original. But this album, for the most part, is kind of like the standard Cryptopsy sound that you might expect from something like Blasphemy Made Flesh. Just with a few different elements. Number one being Lord Worm's vocals. He introduces a lot more of these very heinous high screams. It sounds a lot like what he would go on to do with a black metal side project he was involved in called Rage Nuclei. And the low growls, if I'm being 100% honest, I don't really think they hit the same way like how they did on None So Vile. And number two being the weird elements thrown into the music. You got songs like In the Kingdom Where Everything Dies, The Sky Is Mortal, Super War, that's like an Inquisition song title. And Keeping the Cadaver Dogs Busy has like some quick clean sections thrown in there. But to be fair, Flo Mournier has always said that he wanted Cryptopsy to kind of always, be pushing boundaries, not get complacent, not get too formulaic. And I mean, you know, to give them credit, I think they do that with this album. And I mean, their debut sound, Blasphemy Made Flesh, that was groundbreaking in and of itself. Cryptopsy isn't afraid to try different things and experiment. And you know, sometimes that works out for the better. Sometimes it works out for the worse, which, you know, we'll get to that later. But once again, these songs are quality, and I think if you're a fan of the first two albums, you'll probably dig this album as well. Especially if you want to venture deeper into Cryptopsy's discography, but, you know, Mike DiSalvo's vocals might be too jarring for you, then, you know, absolutely give this one a spin. My favorite songs from the album are Carrion Shine, The Frantic Pace of Dying, and Endless Cemetery. Now, as the band was touring in support of this album, Lord Worm started to encounter more health issues while on the road. Often at the end of every tour, he would get a case of double pneumonia, and you know, he would go back to his teaching job once Cryptopsy was off the road, so teaching with double pneumonia, you know, kind of a pain in the ass. And Lord Worm also just isn't really a big fan of touring in general, so, you know, given all those factors, Lord Worm and the band agreed to part ways again. And now for the second time, the band would have to find a vocalist that could fill the Shaquille O'Neal-sized shoes of Lord Worm. So who would they hire to replace this legendary death metal vocalist? They would hire 19-year-old metalcore singer Matt McGachy from the band 3 Mile Scream? Huh? How and why did Flo pick this guy?
I got a phone call from him about a month and a half later asking if I wanted to join. Chris had recorded my band, so he knew of me and my vocal skills. And I said no. I was like, no, I'm not going to try out or join the band. I'm not interested. I want to make it with 3 Mile. I feel like we're close. And he respected that. And then the leader of 3 Mile quit. And as soon as I hung up the phone with the leader of 3 Mile that quit, and I picked the phone back up and I called Flo and I'm like, are you still looking for someone? And he was like, yes. And that's where it rolled.
From the outside looking in, it's definitely a bit of an odd choice, but I mean, I don't know. I guess, you know, Flo probably picked this guy for a reason. You know, he's young, so he can handle the physical tolls of touring. You know, in addition to that, his vocals should be fresh, you know, for decades to come. You know, Lord Worm had already kind of shown some wear and tear on his vocal performance, so, you know, let's just see how this guy Matt does with Cryptopsy. So with their new vocalist in tow, the band decided to record their 6th album, The Unspoken King. And I'm absolutely sure there will be no controversies or backlash or anything of the sort generated from this album. Just going to be pure sunshine and glory holes. The Unspoken King is an album that forever changed the trajectory and legacy of Cryptopsy overwhelmingly for the negative. This album actually got leaked online before it released, and the fans hated it. The band went from having a somewhat organic sound on Once Was Not to a more produced kind of death/metalcore sound, and even the songs kind of sound deathcore-y. You know, take the track Worship Your Demons. I mean, the circumstances around this album were just absolutely primed to create a perfect storm of fan backlash. You went from having the original vocalist, Lord Worm, fan favorite, to a complete unknown who didn't even have any background in death metal. His background was in metalcore. They would introduce more clean singing on this album as well, which some people kind of saw as a betrayal of death metal. And, you know, the band Cryptopsy, they were darlings of the underground for the longest time, so the fact that they shed a lot of what made their sound unique for kind of what seemed to be more mainstream songwriting approaches, you can understand how the fans felt betrayed. And the fans rushed online, and they absolutely panned this album. And as you can imagine, for a young Matt McGachy, this backlash really, really affected him.
It took many, 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 many years to feel comfortable and have confidence in myself that I'm doing a good job. I think like the turning point of me actually like being on stage and enjoying myself was Maryland Death Fest 2017 when we did None So Vile, and it went, we had a pop. It was an amazing show.
And how did the band respond to this backlash? Well, when they fully released the album, when they went on tour, they had a skit track at the intro called Dinner Time, which it was basically like, just like some fat slob typing on his keyboards like, ugh, I can't believe this new Cryptopsy. They're like all emo. They're singing. How can they do this to me? How can they do this to death metal? And then, his mom is, Johnny! It's dinner time, Johnny! Get off the internet now! So kind of made that skit basically just kind of implying that everyone hating on the album is just a beta soy jack loser that lives with their mom. And as you can imagine, that only further fractured the band's relationship with the fan base. So that's the drama behind the Unspoken King. But what about the music itself? I was only 9 years old when this album came out, so I wasn't around for all the controversy and all that, so I kind of came into it with a fresh set of ears, unbiased set of ears. Is it really that bad? Well, it isn't really all that good, to be honest with you. Some of these songs are just straight up stinky. Listening to Bemoan the Martyr is a more inhumane form of torture than waterboarding. And the song The Plagued is what I imagine a fetus is hearing as it is being aborted. And while this album definitely isn't top shelf, it's not like it's wholly irredeemable. Even if the songs do sound a little deathcore, I still do kind of like Worship Your Demons, Silence Your Tyrants, The Headsman. I even like one of the songs with clean singing on it, Leech. I actually think they should have leaned more into the clean singing on that, because there's a part where there's the clean singing and then kind of underneath it, there's like this high scream overdub, but I think it would actually just sound better with just the clean vocals just straight up. But all in all, while the album isn't really all that good, it's not turbo trash either. Jesus, you would have thought Cryptopsy perpetuated the Holocaust, based on some of the reviews for this album. Don't get me wrong, though. I'm not saying, you should go out of your way to listen to this album or anything like that. Basically, I think you should really only give this album a spin if you're just an absolute Cryptopsy fiend and you've gone through literally everything else in their discography and you still want more, then, feel free to scrape the bottom of the barrel here. And while it is a bummer that this is Cryptopsy's worst album, good news is it can only go up from here, right? A record label can afford for an album to flop, but it becomes much harder to stomach when you're an independent band and your balance sheet consists of whatever is in your overdrafted checking account. So to help right the ship, they actually brought back John Levasseur into the mix. I think the decision to make this a self-titled album was likely a defensive one. I think that was kind of a way for Cryptopsy to kind of like signal to the fans like, hey, we're going back to our roots. Because most bands, when they release a self-titled, it tends to be like their debut or something, early on in their careers. So the band course corrected on two major fronts. Most significantly being Matt McGachy's vocals. They're a lot more of the traditional kind of deep death metal guttural, as opposed to kind of like the MySpace deathcore sound that he had on the previous album, as well as the production changing up. It's a bit less processed from the Unspoken King. It's still pretty, pristine. It's not like we went all the way back to Blasphemy Made Flesh, but it does sound a little bit more like you would expect Cryptopsy to sound. You also got some weird Cryptopsy moments on this album. Redskin Scapegoat has some jazzy bits at the end of the song. And Damn Draft Dodgers, for whatever reason, in the middle of the song, has like 5 seconds of elevator music, and then it just goes right back into, brutal death metal. I'm all for, trying new things and all of that, but Honestly, I don't really think these weird bits do anything to kind of build or develop the songs. They're kind of just thrown in there to be weird. But how good is this album overall? I'd probably give it about a 7 out of 10. You know, I think 2 Pound Torch is a great song. You have those other songs that I mentioned that are pretty good. And in addition to those, I would say I also like Ominous, and what is it? The Golden Square Mile.
That's why we're doing EPs instead of an album, because we want to just deliver quality for solid songs instead of having some like filler or fluff so that we can have an album. And plus it takes us so long to write and to compose. And in between albums, it takes about 3-4 years sometimes. So we want to put out stuff more often.
I remember back to when I was a youngster, and all I knew from Cryptopsy was a few songs off None So Vile. This EP had just come out, so I decided to give it a spin. And I was really impressed by Matt McGachy's vocals on this. I thought his low screams were really good, his high screams were really good. He's definitely come a long way from the Unspoken King, and nowadays he's the kind of vocalist that he can handle whatever craziness Cryptopsy throws at him. I think this EP is another great release to check out if you want to get deeper into Cryptopsy's sound. Now, in my opinion, this EP, not as good as Tome 1. I mean, it's still pretty decent. Vocalist Matt McGachy, he said that the lyrics for this album were very much inspired by None So Vile because in the year previous, 2017, Cryptopsy did a tour where they played that album basically in its entirety. I think revisiting some of those old None So Vile songs that, they haven't played in like 20 years or so probably helped drum up some new inspiration. And aside from that, I don't really have too much else to say. Tome 1 and Tome 2 are kind of like two sides of the same coin. My favorite tracks from this release, I would say, are The Wretched Living and Sire of Sin. As Gomorrah Burns is a very fitting title for this album because back in the early days, Cryptopsy used to be called Gomorrah, until they ran into another band with the same name, so they decided to change theirs. After about a decade of being an independent band, Cryptopsy would decide to hook up with a major record label again, this time Nuclear Blast.
We also realized that it was a lot of work, and a lot of that work sort of fell on me to do a lot of social media stuff and to get the album up and to run the website and all that stuff that the label was doing before. And then there was many discussions over the 10 years that we were independent, late night beer fueled arguments about wanting to get back on a label because we felt that we weren't being seen, especially as the monetarily driven algorithm stepped up on Facebook where we dropped the 2 tomes and we felt like nobody saw it. There's some times that we go play and they're like, I've done interviews for the album coming out and they're like, you've done nothing in 10 years. I'm like, no, we did stuff. Like we were busy.
And I know a lot of people take exception with the production on Nuclear Blast albums, but honestly, I don't really care. I really like this album, and I'm a really big fan of this Cryptopsy lineup that's been together since the 2012 self-titled album. They've just been consistently putting out high-quality material, and this album is no exception. The fact that Fantano said he doesn't like this album is all the proof you need that it kicks more ass than a donkey. The album opener, Lascivious Undivine, a great way to start the album, just immediate, super technical guitar riffs, and Matt's vocals kind of have the precision of Mike DiSalvo, while also having some of the yuckiness of Lord Worm. And later on in the song, he has this really cool, like, maniacal laugh thing that I just think is super sick. As far as the other songs on the album go, Ill Ender, which just has some really nice riffage in the back half of the song. You also got Flayed the Swine, which has a really cool intro and a really cool rest of the song. And if you want a B-side Behemoth, I really like the track Obesian on track 7. So yeah, that is the Cryptopsy Retrospective. You know, I was already a fan of Cryptopsy before I made this video, but I think I became an even bigger fan after making it. You know, I just had a lot of fun going through the interviews, you know, especially Lord Worm. That guy's a lot of fun. He's a really, you know, funny character. And yeah, that's the video. So with all that being said, you know, if you don't have one already, go out there and go get a job. Come on.
Subscribe to the Downfall Network.
No!